Ladies and gentlemen, in this RedGamingTech.com video we're going to be discussing the PlayStation 4 crash, which of course happened at E3. The crash occurred during the demonstration of Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. So, I'm sure many of you have seen the video, it's been floating around. I'm not going to bother to include it in this because, well, copyright and all. But just in case you're not aware of it, it's not particularly amazing to watch. It was basically that gameplay was happening and then it started to stutter a little bit and then it stuttered for a little bit more after it smoothed out for a few more seconds and then it froze. And then after it froze, quite simply, they zoomed out and then the demonstration ended somewhat abruptly, rather obviously, since it crashed, and there was a couple of kind of muted round of applause, as in people weren't really sure what to say, and then the next act hustled on stage quickly. So, what are my thoughts on that? Because I've had a couple of people message or leave comments actually on my Facebook, on RedGamingTech.com Facebook, should I say, which of course is facebook.com/RedGamingTech, and they've asked me, is this bad for the PlayStation 4? As in, is this indicative of the hardware of the future? Or is it simply E3? Or is it simply because of bad coding? Or is it something else? Is it something inherent, like a fault with the PlayStation? Or is it something to do with the atmosphere of E3? In other words, possibly the heat and so forth? Well, it could be a multitude of things. To be honest with you, some of this is going to be speculation, but there are some things to remember. First of all, the game's code that was running is not final. It's not even close to being done, okay? It's not even like a demo. It is literally alpha/beta stuff. Therefore, because it's real time, it's not pre-rendered stuff, in other words, it's not like a video footage, you always run the risk of something falling over. Why? Because it doesn't take much for code to fall over. It's a simple case of that, really. I mean, look how often YouTube bugs out if they're rolling out a new feature. It crashes. I mean, right this second, as I'm recording this, I'm actually supposed to be editing and doing descriptions for some other videos that were uploaded, but I have to actually leave it on private because we can't actually edit stuff because we're getting YouTube server errors. And it's a simple case of they are obviously trying to fix something / roll out features, and it breaks something meanwhile. Now, my point being is that games now are becoming increasingly complicated, so when you risk showing something live, there is a good chance it's going to break and or not perform as you would expect. It's that simple, especially as obviously they are getting used to new hardware. You can argue as much as you like about the PS4/Xbox One becoming closer to PCs. The bottom line is, well, it's still mostly a new engine. They've made some significant changes, modifications. Secondly, it is not a PC. Right, there are some similarities between it and a PC, specifically the x86/64 nature and so forth. But, well, it's not a PC, okay? And that's really all there is to it on that. So they're still getting used to the hardware. Now, if it was the Xbox One that had crashed, I would have said exactly the same thing. Now, is there concern that the system itself could be overheating? Well, it's very early to say. From what my research shows, and I can't really get a super definitive answer, but it seems that from what I've been researching, what was shown, or should I say the systems that were shown, are basically advanced dev kits. So in other words, they are not a PlayStation 4 that is running, because they're obviously still doing alterations to the system, most likely cooling at this stage and possibly BIOS, OS as well. And we know that the PS4 has not been completely finalized. Like, for example, we're not actually even sure how much RAM is being dedicated to the OS. At this point, we assume it's going to be about 1 gig, but it has not been 100% confirmed. Similarly, we don't even know how many CPUs have been allocated to OS functionality. Why? Because Sony don't know yet, because they are still crunching the numbers. After all, the system is not out tomorrow. And I'd say exactly the same thing if it was the Xbox One. It is irrelevant. Neither system is out yet, therefore they are still finalizing and fine-tuning the system. Sure, they're not going to suddenly say, okay, we're going to double the amount of RAM. No, of course not. But they are going to be doing things such as figuring out cooling systems, figuring out on fault testing to make sure everything's running fine and isn't overheating, as well as fault tolerance and so forth, and just generally making sure that the system runs as you would expect. Most likely as well, they're probably going to be doing performance fine-tuning with the BIOS and so forth as well. So even if the PS4 was a full retail console, or equivalent to the retail console, it's probably still beta. So in other words, they're still probably fine-tuning it anyway in terms of the operating system and so forth anyway. And of course, the game itself is still beta. Plus, you've got to bear in mind things such as driver revisions, and everything else. For example, it could just be, and I'll give you a really simple one. Let's say you had a PC. It could be an out-of-date driver for, say, the sound card, or a sound card bug, memory issue, map, anything. It's just like, actually, that doesn't exist, crashes. Okay, it happens all the time. I've played, my PC's pretty much rock stable, and I still have issues with the odd game here and there where it just decides I don't actually like living anymore and just conks out. The other day, I can't remember which game it was, but it may have been like Torchlight 2 or whatever, and I don't know why, I just happened to Alt-Tab to the desktop, come back, move for a second, it crashed. And it's not happened since. It's just one of those rarities. These things sometimes happen as things become, well, quite simply put, they become more complicated. So in other words, maybe a little bit of data gets lost during, say, the Alt-Tab. In other words, as it's switching between virtual and real memory or whatever. It can be dozens of different things. Now, we are going to talk, however, about possibilities of heat, because that is foolish not to speak about now. And Microsoft supposedly are having issues with heat. I say supposedly because, well, it's not confirmed. I don't hear someone from the Microsoft team give a, well, indication yet of what issues they're having with the GPU, if any. But the story goes, and by the way, you can check out the video on this, which goes into a lot more detail. I've got it on the channel, of course. But supposedly Microsoft are underclocking, or needing right at this stage to underclock the GPU of the AMD Jaguar. Now that basically means that they're getting just under 1 T-flop of computing power from the GPU, which is about half that of the PS4. And supposedly this is to do with heat, because the die size of the AMD Jaguar, because they've got the Move engines in there, because they've got that embedded RAM in there, 32 megabytes of ESRAM, of course. It turns out that the whole thing is producing a lot of heat. Now, the problem with this, of course, is it's not necessarily true. Okay, it's very easy to cite sources, and even if it is someone from Microsoft who said it, it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. That's the other really important thing. And sources have a way of just, I have like, for example, I could say to you guys, I have sources. Someone anonymously wrote to me claiming that they are from, I don't know, Nintendo, and that the Wii U 2 is going to be out in 6 months. It doesn't mean it's true. On the other hand, rumors in this generation particularly have been fairly accurate. For example, the specifications of the Xbox One, formerly then of course known as Durango, and the PlayStation 4, formerly known of course as Orbis, were fairly accurate. I mean, sure, there were a few bits and pieces off, specifically to do with the RAM of the PS4, and a few other bits and bobs, but generally speaking, they were pretty darn accurate. But obviously, there were also some really stupid rumors that just didn't turn out to be true. Like, some people were citing that there was an Xbox 360 stock inside the PS4, or Xbox One. Of course, I reported it, but it was unsubstantiated, and it turned out to be completely false. There were other rumors, of course, which said that, the PS4 would have X, or that the Xbox One would do Y, or that the Wii U would be overclocked. And the problem is, initially you have to report the stuff because you're not sure if it's actually true, and then after a couple of weeks or a couple of months in some cases, it does become true. In the case of Black Flag and the crash, I'm not going to read anything into it. If it had been the Xbox One, I may have read into it a little bit more simply because of the GPU heat issues that had been mentioned. But obviously the PS4 and Xbox One have similar hardware, although there are some significant changes in terms of the APU, the Jaguar, because of the GDDR5 RAM of the PS4 and the DDR3 of the Xbox. In other words, that ESRAM and the Move engines which are required. And as I've said before, the whole reason behind Xbox One going this route, and the reason that they had less GCN engines to base it up, GCN cores, on the Xbox One, is simply because they didn't believe that the DDR5 RAM would be prevalent in such abundant quantities. Also, they were quite rightly concerned about the pricing of the memory. And obviously, it's turned out that Sony are most likely taking a possibly financial hit. We're not sure about how much. I'm going to be trying to figure that out over the next couple of days. But as for this crash, not really worried about it. We'll have to see just what happens. Obviously, the previous generation of systems both had issues. Xbox much more so than the PS3, but the PS3 was not fault-free. Obviously, it had the yellow light of death, whatever you wanted to call it, and also had, I believe, Blu-ray drive issues as well. Although I believe some systems did overheat, and I think there were some firmware issues. There were so many issues with the previous generation of consoles. Even the original Wii had problems, and that was like basically an overclocked GameCube. Because it's impossible not to have issues when you're rolling out new hardware. The key isn't do one or two units have problems. The key is always how many of the units have problems. For example, let's say you were to ship, I don't know, let's say 2 million units, and 10,000 of them were returned because they were faulty, and there were numerous faults. So maybe some had bad solder, some had bad drives, some had bad memory, some had bad GPUs, whatever. In other words, it was just something. Maybe it was even damaged in shipping. Cool. That's fine and understandable. Nothing is impervious. On the other hand, if you have like 25% of all your consoles being shipped back to you in, say, 6 months' time, or within 6 months' time, and they've all got a similar fault, say they're all overheating, or they're all having their drive fail, that's a different problem. That's obviously an inherent fault with the hardware, and obviously Microsoft went through some trying times. They actually lost some sales because of the Xbox 360 Red Ring of Death whole fiasco. Some people are already saying, the Xbox 360 and the PS4 are going to have the same problems. And in some respects, obviously the PS4 could well have some issues with heat because the case is smaller. Smaller usually means heat. Obviously is a bigger problem, right? The smaller devices, the less efficient it is at getting rid of heat. That's one of the reasons that, for example, the Ivy Bridge CPUs or the Haswell CPUs even from Intel are actually not that great at overclocking compared to, say, the Sandy Bridge. Now, it doesn't mean they can't overclock, but the clock speeds are often worse. I say often because obviously if you start getting to extravagant cooling and you're really lucky with your CPU samples, that's not necessarily the case. But often an average CPU from Sandy Bridge and an average CPU from, say, Ivy or Haswell will overclock about the same / worse, and it's simply because of heat dissipation. Now, having said that, I haven't looked at some of the latest Ivy Bridge reviews where they've been doing like lapping or trying to really push it, but from the early stuff I've been reading, it seems that it's certainly the case, and it certainly was the case for Ivy Bridge. So one of the thoughts was that if basically you had a really good overclocking Sandy, it probably wasn't worth you buying an Ivy, unless you wanted to go from, like, say, a 2500K to say a 3700, but you guys get the idea anyway. So yeah, I'm not really worried about the Assassin's Creed thing. It's not really a big deal. There are too many variables. There are honestly like half a dozen reasons it could have conked. And sure, hardware is a possibility, but I don't think it was even running on a proper PS4 system. I'm not saying it wasn't, but from my research, I don't think it was, and it doesn't really make sense for them to be. I will be doing a bit more research on that, but as far as I'm aware, it wasn't. But either way, even if it was, it's not really a big deal anyway. Issues like that always happen. Microsoft have had them with operating systems in the past. Of course, you had the Windows 98 famous crash, the blue screen, and it just happens. I didn't really blame Microsoft for it back then, even though I was fairly young, but these things do happen with new OSs, new hardware and software, because you can't, if you're showing off something new and shiny, you're going to make a mistake occasionally, I'm afraid. So yeah, not really concerned. That isn't to say that I won't be looking out for heat issues for the PS4 or Xbox One, because I will be curious, since both systems are going to be pretty darn complicated, if there are going to be inherent faults. This to me doesn't give me an indication that there will be an inherent fault. This to me is just that it happened at E3 at a live show with unfinished hardware, unfinished software, playing an alpha game. On the other hand, I will be looking out for faults anyway, because I'm curious to see just if there are going to be problems. I would not be surprised if Microsoft... In one respect, I have a feeling that Microsoft are going to be less likely to have issues than Sony. That's not to say they will be, but why? Because of the ridiculous fire that they came under from the Xbox 360. To be honest, if they didn't learn something from that, they might as well just pull out of the hardware market, because, well, after the battering that they just took from Xbox 360, especially since they're having all these DRM issues, I really don't think they really want the hardware problems as well. I mean, could you imagine the headlines? Xbox One, 30% failure rate, plus all DRM issues, plus all the DRM problems as used games and everything else, which, some people are cool with, some people hate. I'm not really going to take sides, but still, it's not particularly great marketing, so I think they're going to be pretty darn cautious with what they're doing. So, we'll see. Anyway, this has been a bit of a ranty/rambly video, but I just wanted to address the concerns because, as I said, a few people have been messaging me / asking me about this stuff, and I just wanted to... Well, since some people have asked, I figure I might as well put out a video rather than just messaging people one person at a time. Anyway, I think that just about does it for this particular video. I will be covering stuff in a lot more technical detail over the next couple of days because I actually have some time off work, which is, yes, amazing. I will also be trying to put in some game time as well. I wish to complete The Last of Us. Woohoo. Anyway, I think that just about does it for this particular video, so hopefully you all stick with me and I will see you soon. Take care and bye for now.